My name's Ian, I'm from Loughborough University and I'm going to talk about engagement and understanding in mathematics through comparative peer assessment. And what I'm going to talk about derives from what's called the law of comparative judgment. This was something discovered by, amongst others, an American psychologist, Louis Thurston. And the law of comparative judgment says that people are inconsistent when making absolute judgments. So if we were all in a room together and I said, what's the temperature? We'd get a range of answers. We would not be consistent. But if I said, let's all go outside, is it warmer inside or outside? We'd suddenly all be consistent. We'd suddenly all agree with each other. Because as people, we're very good at making relative judgments, or very consistent at making relative judgments. Yeah, so we can apply the law of comparative judgment to education. So to assess mathematical thinking, we're going to assess mathematical thinking and we're going to involve peers, students in that. That's where our peer learning will come from. We're going to need a few things. First of all, an open-ended prompt, some sort of genuinely open-ended maths question to which students can produce an extended response. So we're hoping, and I'll show an example of this in a minute, we're hoping to tap things like conceptual understanding, sustained reasoning, problem solving. These types of important but nebulous learning outcomes that are quite difficult to capture with traditional items and assessments. To assess this, we're not going to need any rubrics. There's no red pen, no marking scheme, nothing like that. We do, however, need one high-order criterion. So whereas a rubric or a marking scheme has many detailed criteria, we're just going to deal with one high-order criterion. In the example I'm going to show you, that criterion is understanding of derivative, for example. We're going to need people to do the assessing. We call them judges with comparative judgment. These will be the students judging their peers' work and us as well, lecturers. And we're going to need a piece of technology to run this thing, a comparative judgment engine. And the one to use, if you're using comparative judgment in university teaching, is a Moodle plugin. We developed this at Loughborough in 2020. We'd been meaning to for a while, but the pandemic accelerated our work. So if you've got Moodle, great, there's a plugin. If you don't have Moodle, the plugin can still work. I understand learning management systems are getting more compatible these days. Okay, so here's an example of a use case. This is how I've been using comparative judgment for a few years now with foundation maths students at Loughborough University. And the overall idea is over a semester I have 2, 3, 4 formative peer assessment sessions, which I'm going to talk about in detail. And then at the end there is a synoptic test using comparative judgment. So there is a summative peer assessment that contributes towards the module grade. And a great thing about comparative judgment when applied to peer assessment is you still get reliable, valid outcomes. So here is an example of an open-ended task. I use quite a lot of different types of task. But this one is a common format when I use this at Loughborough. How would you explain to someone what a derivative is? Use examples, diagrams and writing to help make it clear. Include everything you know about derivatives. So yeah, I mean the format of this question, I've used it for all sorts of concepts. You can explain what an equation is, or just ask what is an equation. So the idea is you have some concept or topic of interest, derivative. You ask the students what it is, and then you encourage them to sort of flush themselves out and write as much as they can and get plenty onto the page. Okay, what I'm going to do now is skip to a browser. So here I have set up just in a sort of dummy Moodle page some examples of comparative judgment. So these, if you do use Moodle, these are the assignment activities. So you set up an assignment when you want students to submit work. And this one has been set up with a comparative judgment plugin in the background. So the first time the student clicked this, they saw add submission. That submission has now been added. Here it is. And instead, we now get do comparison. So if I click this, I'm going to see two pieces of work side by side. There we are. And the students are asked, to decide which student has demonstrated the better understanding of derivative. That's our high order criterion that I talked about earlier. So the idea is I read these two pieces of work. These are just one-page tests. They could be, they can be many pages. You can include any media format, actually, video, audio files, even anything that Moodle will accept as an assignment file that will work with comparative judgment. So I have a good read of these things. Maybe I want to enlarge it. That's not a problem. I just click download and then I can view it separately and make it as big as I want. Notice everything's anonymised. I think that's important in peer assessment where possible. So even the file name has been altered by the Comparative Judgement plugin. So you don't know whose work it is. This is just an internal number. So I have a good read of these two and I decide, I don't know, pretend I've read them and I've decided the right ones are better. I click that and then I get two more to look at. If I want, I can leave comments for either one of these portfolios, either one of these tests. Those comments will be fed back to the students by the Comparative Judgement plugin. Now, how I've been using this is in one of my formative assessment sessions. I give students these one of these open-ended questions. They have a go. They upload it themselves to the assignment activity in Moodle. And then I like to book a lab for the judging, for the peer judging phase. So I might assign students, say, 10 judgments each. And I like them to work in 2s or 3s and discuss what they think makes a good response to this question. So they might have a computer each, but I'll encourage them to talk to their neighbour about what they're doing and how they're making their judgment decisions. And I found that works quite well because, of course, we're not providing them a rubric. We don't have a top-down model of what we're telling them makes a good answer. We're asking them to derive that ground up through having a go, looking at one another's work and, crucially, discussing what they're doing with others. And the students I've found tend to come up with the same sorts of things we would come up with for what makes a good quality response to this type of prompt. For example, being mathematically correct and accurate, using a range of representations. In these examples, both students in different ways have used writing, they've used formal notation, equations, they've also used graphs as well. Illustrating a point with an example, using several examples, connecting it to real world examples or connecting it to other areas of maths, being comprehensive, these sorts of things that we might expect in a good quality answer. The students tend to come up with those things as well. When students have made a number of judgments, I might then have a whole class discussion, bring them together and ask them as a class to talk about what makes a good quality answer and as well what features of an answer they didn't like so much. So they're generating their idea of what makes a good answer towards in preparation for that final test. And I don't know, I find this quite worthwhile learning activity on its own terms. Now, I'm not going to go into too much detail about this, it's coming up a bit later, but Comparative Judgement, this plugin, it also generates scores. Once you've got enough judgments, you press a button and it converts those judgments into a score for each student, so on a range of 0 to 100, although you can scale those scores later. So one thing I can do in the class discussion is just bring up the top 1 or 2 rated responses. They're anonymised, of course, so I can show them, what came out top, what was most valued when they did their judgments. I tend not to show them lower down ones. I certainly don't show them the worst. We're not interested in embarrassing anyone, even if it is anonymous. Okay, let me just get my slides back. Yeah, okay, so that's the basic mechanics and the idea of how I use it with students getting discussion going. And a few questions that people have about comparative judgment when you first show them. I thought I'd just go through these. First, people are often wary about it because it's norm referenced rather than criteria referenced. So the idea is here that the assessment, and if you are using it in a summative context and getting grades, it's all just relative. It's all just based on how well one student did compared to another. So a common concern is, well, what if I'm unlucky and my cohort are all geniuses And I'm pretty good, but I end up looking rubbish. So this idea that it's norm referenced inherently. Well, that is not the case. There are various methods for benchmarking comparative judgment outcomes. Now that I've used it for a few years, what I tend to do, and I use the same questions, what I tend to do is have some responses from previous years which I consider to be on the grade boundary. Let's say we're using traditional degree outcomes. So I'd have one or two responses that I've deemed to be borderline 2-1 first, another that I deem to be borderline 2-1 2-2. Now the students don't know which ones are from the past year when they're judging, and me too when I'm doing my judgments. It's just another test. But at the end, when I look at the scores, I have those cut grades automatically in there, and they are seeded from the previous year. So it turns out that actually comparative judgment is particularly strong for criterion referencing, arguably more so than traditional methods, despite that feeling of it being norm referenced. So I mentioned that our standard setting is a particular strength. In fact, that's how education people 10, 15 years ago first got interested in comparative judgment. A particular strength is it's better at being criterion referenced, which is a bit counterintuitive. Yeah, you can compare unlike objects. That's perhaps I'll not go into that into the interests of time. But yeah, the simple answer really in a way is however you generate scores, whether it's marking, whether it's comparative judgment, whether it's reading the tea leaves, whatever it is, you can choose with those scores to norm reference or criterion reference them. Yeah, here's just an example of criterion referencing from a previous year where from left to right we've got all the individual students. Up the side is a parameter estimate. I said earlier a score of 0 to 100. Under the bonnet, the actual mechanics produces these sort of Z-score type values with a mean of 0. We translate those before we give them to student. But in this case, those top three, I've got these 4 highlighted responses were my cut grades from previous years seeded into the pot. So 3 of them there got the top score. The modal outcome for these students was the second top grade, and then we got 3 got the worst grade down there. So that's just one way that you can put cut scores into comparative judgment. I'll not talk about the reliability at the bottom in the interest of time, but there are reliability measures. In other words, you can be reassured that whoever did the judging here, as long as they were paying attention and knew their maths well enough, we'd have got the same scores. Yeah, isn't it opaque? So no marking schemes, no rubrics. You've got to deal with this issue of students asking for marking schemes and rubrics. And also for external moderators, you could argue it's opaque because it's all based on judgments in the heads of the judges. And yeah, fair enough, it is. It's a different conceptualisation of validity. Rather than the validity being in a rubric or a marking scheme and red pen marks, the validity does reside in the collective judgments of experts. So for the summative assessments, I ask the students to do maybe 10 judgments each, but then myself as lecturer, I'll contribute 100 or 200 judgments as well. Depending on the size of the cohort, I want to make sure I've seen every response 3 or 4 times and that I've gone through the judging thoroughly. And that's where the validity comes from, our judgment of it. Yeah, and there's various ways that studies have been done to show the validity of comparative judgment, including when peers have contributed judgments. So there is a good body of evidence, including at higher education. So yeah, kind of is opaque, but I think what we get, the advantages of comparative judgment when it's appropriate for these sort of nebulous conceptual understanding, problem solving skills, is worth the payoff. Yeah, here's a big one. No red pen means no feedback. So yeah, if you're in an institution where there is a top-down diktat that feedback means red ink on their work, then maybe comparative judgment isn't for you. If we're freed of that rather narrow view of feedback, then comparative judgment offers quite a rich type of different sorts of feedback. I mean, for one thing, students can and do write comments. I showed you that little comment box earlier. So, okay, it might not be red ink on the work, but we do get written comments for feedback traditionalists. But I tell the students that their feedback is different when they're using comparative judgment. A bit like we have to tell them there's no rubric, no marking scheme. You will learn what a good answer is through engaging in these activities, and they do, and students seem to accept that approach. And feedback comes in different forms to Red Pen. Feedback is getting to see your peers' work as well. So you've had a go at this open-ended question. You then get to see what others have done. That's the type of feedback. Discussion in small groups, in 2s or 3s when doing judging, is a type of feedback. The whole class discussion as well is a type of feedback, seeing which submissions come on top at the end. So it's conceptualising feedback as something the students take ownership of, something richer than red ink on their work. But you do get the comments as well. Okay, thank you very much. That was a bit of a rush through. I'm sure people still have some questions. I'm very sorry I couldn't be with you today, but please do email me if you do have any questions. And if you want to have a look at the plugin, I mean, this is more something for your IT tech team to get onto if you want it installed. There's the GitHub address for where the code is, but there are also some help documents. There's a longer video as well where I talk for about 50 minutes. On a similar subject to what I've presented on today. Okay, thank you very much.